Okay, so this is, actually the original idea from this came from trying to understand that. And one of the interesting patterns when you look at those kind of labor demand at a local level, the idea is thinking about labor demand not just in terms of firms, but aggregate labor markets, local labor markets. And one of the things you see, and this comes from one of the papers that David Card referenced, his paper on the Mariel boat lift, when you bring big numbers of immigrants in, not only do you see that the wage rate doesn't tend to move, you look 3 years out, 5 years out, it seems to have gone back to roughly where you would have expected it to be. The employment rate does the same thing. And so what happens is, in some sense, you're bringing in more labor supply, and the number of jobs created seems to go up to match it. That's even controlling while you control for the wage. And so one of the things that we were interested in is, okay, is that true potentially partly because immigrants bring with them some of what you might see as a relatively fixed factor, which is entrepreneurship. So in some sense, an immigrant inflow, a cohort comes in, and embedded in it are the entrepreneurs. And so that's sort of the genesis of this, in fact, is to try to understand something more about immigrant entrepreneurship and what kind of role they play. This is joint work with Huju Yu, who's there, and who you'll hear about from tomorrow. You'll hear from tomorrow, Yuri Ostrowski, who's sitting right next to him, and Garnet Pico, many of you know. The specific goal in this paper is to try to understand the processes of moving into firm ownership amongst immigrants. This is largely a descriptive paper. We're interested in this for two reasons. One is because firm ownership is such a large component of the immigrant experience. And there are many papers that show that in one way or another. Let me show you that in the context of the data that we're going to use. The data we're going to use is a variant on the seed data, so tax data matched from workers and firms. This shows the proportion of all tax filers following, just think of it as following the 2001 entry cohort over the years in Canada. Each point is the proportion of tax filers in that year who own a business. And here it is all businesses combined, incorporated, not incorporated, with and without employees, even if it's a very small part of your income. So this is just any firm ownership. And what you can see is that it starts, and by the way, the orange dot is the same thing, but for roughly non-immigrants, for a comparison group. And what you can see is by the first full year after entry, or actually attaining landed status, the ownership rate is around 12%, but by the time you get to 9 years out, it's over 25% of immigrants are in some sort of form of ownership at that point. If you actually look at the cumulative rate, so one of the things you can do with this data is you can see the people moving in and out of this state. The proportion by 9 years out who have owned a firm at any time is closing on 40%. So this definitely is a big part of the immigrant experience. I don't actually have that number for the Canadian born. The other reason to be interested in this is because it is from a sort of policy angle, right? Which is that virtually, I mean, people can correct me, but most developed economies, as part of their immigrant selection system, have a component that is targeted at trying to bring in immigrant entrepreneurs with an idea that they are an entrepreneurial group, they bring innovation, and they're going to create jobs. And part of what we're interested in is looking at the processes of immigrants moving into their first firm ownership and trying to understand, is that a good way to think about what's going on, that we're seeing a bunch of people trying to innovate? Or alternatively, another view that's put forward in the literature, and I apologize, I didn't put up all the references that are in the paper, but the alternative is that they're in some sense pushed into it, right? And there, a really key distinction is going to be between incorporated firms, where you have to make a serious effort in order to open this firm, and what are sometimes called just pure self-employment, or at least non-incorporated spells. And most of the non-incorporated spells, by the way, have no employees. There's a recent paper by Levine and Rubenstein in which they argue that you can distinguish between these two, that the people who end up opening an incorporated firm are high cognitive ability, high risk takers, and high rule breakers. And the people who open sort of self-employed, non-incorporated firms are none of those things. So they're very different groups. And again, it sort of fits with the idea of being pushed into the latter and maybe trying to get into the former. The data, I'm going to tell you about the data in more detail in a moment. The data is sort of amazing, but since this is a conference about amazing data, this is just like another ho-hum data set to all you people. But, you'll see it in a sec. I mean, one of the things that at least I found out, Yuri and Huju are sort of patient with me all the time, is just the incredible complexity of dealing with these data sets. We've literally been at this for years at this point, and part of that is just because, you know, every time we try something, we learn something new about this data that is, requires some extra thought. We're going to think about the factors that can affect the processes in three groups. One is the characteristics at time of entry. Those are going to come from immigrant landing documents. So that's sort of like, given what the government sees now, can you predict particularly well who's going to become an entrepreneur? The second is experiences after arrival. That's built from the tax records, the immigrants' own tax records. So those are earnings and employment patterns. And the third thing that we're going to be interested in, which you already heard some about earlier, was the role of the enclave. Does it take a village to raise an entrepreneur, right? So here the notion is, as everyone here knows, enclaves are a very big component of the immigrant experience, and they can affect entrepreneurship through a number of channels. One is potentially by providing a sort of captive low-wage labor market, right? You have other people from the same source country, same language and cultural background. They're having trouble, possibly for linguistic reasons, of accessing a broader market, so they become your sort of captive labor market, labor force to some degree. There's also, it potentially provides a market for goods related to the ethnic group. And then, you know, famous stories of things like the sort of Korean small business owners turning capital over to the next generation that follows them. The other thing is that, of course, it's also potentially the labor market where the entrepreneur would work, and so it has to do with opportunity cost. So the main findings, should I not get there, and watching the clock, I'm not going to get to everything. Immigrants are, quote unquote, more entrepreneurial. You just saw that. They end up with higher firm ownership rates than the native born. But I'll show you in a sec, that's actually mostly because of this non-incorporated firm ownership. We can look at the business class immigrants, the ones who are let in particular to open firms, and preferably firms that employ others. They do disproportionately open firms, but not necessarily to the extent that you think they're going to, not as high a level. And their ultimate impact is small because they're a small group relative to the people let in the other classes. So it's really how the other classes, the family class and the selected class, it's really how they end up behaving that's going to drive whether immigration is bringing a lot of new firm growth into the economy. Ethnic enclaves have wage and revenue patterns that do seem to encourage incorporated firm ownership. Well, after you take those into account, enclave effects tend to be negative, and that's important as we think about we think about the fact that immigrants tend to live in those kind of ethnic enclaves. And like my conclusion, and this is not necessarily shared by the other two, we sort of haven't hashed this all out so far, but my conclusion is this is broadly negative in terms of if you really think that immigration as a whole is going to be doing a lot for you in terms of innovation and job creation. My sort of take from this part of the project is not so much so far. So here's the data. The data, as I said, is a variant of the seed data. So the starting point is the IMDb, so that's got all of the records from the immigrant landing records when they attain landed status. So we know everything about we know their class, their education at that time, their age at that time, marital status, et cetera. Included in that is when they arrive, they're issued a social insurance number. Through that, we can link to their own tax records. Those are the T1 tax records down here, and from that we'll see earnings. The other thing we'll see in the T1 tax records is whether they open a non-incorporated firm. If they have a non-incorporated firm, that's where they report the income, and so we can see them as that kind of firm owner. We also get the business number from there if in the financial declaration form, and that can link to the fourth data set. But before going to that, the other main data set here is the T2, which is the firm tax records. Firms, privately incorporated firms, file a form called a Schedule 50, and on that Schedule 50 is listed everybody who owns at least a 10% share in the firm. along with their social insurance number. So from that, we can link back to the immigrant landing records and on to the immigrant's own tax records. The T2 is also then linked into the LEAP through the firm's business number. The LEAP contains essentially links to all the employees of the firms. So the other thing we can see is who works for the firm that this person opens. Is it, for example, people who come from the same ethnic community or the same source country as the owner? And that's something that we're going to use as we go along. So it's very rich data. We're going to allow for 5 possible states here. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second. Non-employment, that means no earned income in the year. Primarily employed, which means your main, I'll get back to the order in a second. Primarily employed, so paid employed. Primarily non-incorporated firm owner, so that means that you have income from a firm on your T1, and you get more income from that than you do from other sources, including employment. The owner of an incorporated firm with employees and then without employees. And we actually run the order from bottom to top here. So first, we say anybody who's an incorporated firm owner at all, we're going to call them a firm owner in order to sort of bias in that direction. You'll see that numbers are small here in any case. Then from there, depending on what if you're not an incorporated firm owner, then we assign you to the other categories based on where your major source of income is coming from. And our interest is essentially in following people where we assume they enter in one of the first 2 states, and we ask how long until they open a firm. That is, they open one of the 3 that follow. There's an interesting question here that we've been grappling with most recently, which is whether these incorporated firms without employees are real things, or whether they're just sort of some kind of shell, and so we shouldn't really actually set up for tax purposes, so we shouldn't spend too much time on them. There's some reasons to think that that's the case. So for example, the median net income for firms with employees is 45 times that of firms without employees, and for firms without employees, their median net annual income is $289, which makes you think something else is going on here. But on the other hand, so this is, Lars told me earlier this should be in various colors, which sounded cool, but it's not. This is a transition matrix, so you're going to read this across the rows. So the first row says in period 1, so year, let's say 2004, 88 for people who own a firm, an incorporated firm with employees, 88% were still in that state in the following year. 8% still owned an incorporated firm but now had no employees. 0.6% roughly had moved into self-employment, that is a primarily non-incorporated ownership, and so on. And what you can see here is that, in fact, incorporated firms with no employees do move to the state of being an incorporated firm with employees at a pretty high rate. So they seem to be something more than just shells. In contrast, if you look at the third line, the non-incorporated, so essentially the self-employed, don't move into incorporated firm ownership at a particularly high rate at all. So it's not like people are opening non-incorporated firms and then later they think, oh, the idea is good enough, so now I'm going to incorporate. That's not happening very much. If you go down the line, you'll see that paid employees move into incorporated firm ownership only at about a rate of about 0.25% per year. So 0.25% per year, right? Let me keep moving. So I'm not going to do data issues right now. There's lots of them. This again is the picture that I showed you before. Here's the same data, but now broken down by into the different kind of firm types. So the blue line here shows you immigrants, the proportion of immigrants who own a firm that is incorporated and has employees. And that sort of is, in some sense, we think of as the gold standard. That's probably what the government is hoping to get when they open the doors. And you can see that it starts out at almost 0. It rises by the end of 13 years to almost 5%. The little dot right underneath it is the same number for the native-born for all ages between 18 and 69. And you can see by the end, they've just basically reached the same level as the native-born. For the group that has incorporated but doesn't have employees, that line sort of actually flattens out a lot. Some of that could be conversions into incorporated with employees. Again, by the end, they're sort of roughly at the place where the native-born are. Where the immigrants are really different is in the non-incorporated ownership. And the yellow line here shows you primarily non-incorporated, and the difference between the two shows you the people who are like a real estate agent on the side but haven't incorporated. So you can see from this that the main reason that immigrants are bigger firm owners is mostly has to do, or has almost entirely to do with this non-incorporated state. What we're going to do is estimate a competing risks model where we're going to start with workers grouped together in the employed or non-employed state. I can talk more about that in a bit. But we're essentially then going to track them until they move into one of the other firm ownership states. We're interested in time until you open a firm, in essence. So in these models, you can think of each of these possible destinations for a worker who's just arrived and is, say, non-employed. They could move, there's a certain latent time until they open an incorporated firm with employees, or an incorporated firm without employees, or another latent time to open a self-employed firm. And associated with each one of those is a hazard process, a probability of transiting into ownership conditional on not having done that up to that point. And then essentially the length of time a person stays in the employed or non-employed state is whichever one of those times comes up first. So it's sort of, you're running along as a non-employed worker, and there's these sort of risks coming along of you opening a firm, and whichever one of those plays up first, that's the end of the non-employed employed state, and we see you opening a firm at that point. The estimation is pretty simple. The estimation is really just essentially a set of sort of pooled probits where you're looking at the set of people who have so far not opened a firm, and you ask what's the probability that they open an incorporated firm. And then you estimate another one for what is the probability they open an incorporated firm without employees, and a third one for what's the probability they open a firm that is self-employed. We allow the coefficients to be different in all of those. If one of them happens, so if you open an incorporated firm, that person drops out of the data set and is no longer used for estimating the process for opening, say, a self-employed firm. So let me show you these are probability derivatives, and you'll notice that they're all quite small. But remember, the base we're talking about here is an annual probability for employed workers of about 0.25% of opening a firm. So this is relative to that. We've allowed everything to be different for the first year after entry versus later years on the assumption that potentially things really change for you. And in fact, we do see some of that. So the first two columns are for the process determining the probability that a person opens an incorporated firm with employees. And there you can see his age is positively related to that in the first year, which probably has to do with having some amount of resources with the person at that point. But by later years, it's actually negatively related. The female effect is negative everywhere. Everything we estimate, women are less likely to open firms. But being married is positive. You're more likely to open firms. Some of the more interesting ones is probably the education. Right after arrival, education has no effect in that first year of your probability of opening an incorporated firm with employees. But by later years, there's a positive relationship where the base category here is high school or high school dropout. But on the other hand, for the people who have non-incorporated firms, the sort of self-employed, which remember is the biggest group here amongst the firm owners, it's sort of flattish at the start, but then it actually turns somewhat negative. So this is another piece of evidence that sort of fits in line with the notion that people are in some sense being pushed into those into that form of firm ownership, that it's not, well actually you'll see the push in a second, but that it's not necessarily associated with positive productivity characteristics. This is now broken down by immigrant class, so the omitted category here is family class. The skilled means that you're assessed under the point system for something other than business. Then there's the various business classes. PA here means principal applicant, it's the person who actually is applying. Then the non-PAs are the accompanying family members, essentially, right? And so what you can see is that the skilled groups and the family are sort of roughly similar for the most part. What's really, there really is a tendency for the people who are brought in as entrepreneurs, that is in the entrepreneur class, they have a much higher probability of opening a firm in the first year and in subsequent years. Still, regardless of this, by the end, in any given year, only about 13 or 14% of them own a firm in that year. Cumulatively, about 60% of them will open a firm by the time they're here for 13 years, an incorporated firm. But it's not like, you let them in to open firms. It's not like it's 100% who are opening firms by any stretch. And then you can see the speaks English or French. This is, again, at time of arrival. And there you can see that there's a positive relationship with opening an incorporated firm, but there's actually a mild negative effect for the probability of opening a self-employed firm, which again fits with this notion that those firm openings have to do with lower skill types. This one should have had colors for sure. But this is actually what we wanted to do, was try to understand what happens as people move through the possible earnings and employment patterns. Okay, so what we did was we created the 5 quintiles for all years combined of earnings. We created dummies corresponding to each one of those earnings groupings, plus 1 dummy for whether you were not employed at all. So Q0 is not employed at all. Then we looked at people, grouping them into those essentially 36 possible categories in the previous year to the year we're looking at, and 2 years previous to that. So for example, over here at this is the coefficient on the dummy that corresponds to a person who was in the 5th quintile of earnings in both the last 2 years. Okay, how does this affect the probability of opening an incorporated firm, or how is it associated with it? Affect is too strong a word. And what you roughly see is that for people above the diagonal, that is people who are moving down, okay, from year T-2 to T-1, they have a positive probability of opening. That could have to do with some kind of tax behavior. In the lower half, there's sort of a lower probability. So if people are doing better from year T-2 to T-1, they're less likely to open an incorporated firm. But the really strong patterns here are for the self-employed. So for the self-employed here, what you can see is just take any column. Say take the Q3 column and work down. So that's a person who was in the 3rd quintile in year T-2, and then was either unemployed last in T-1, or was in Q1, or stayed in and went to Q2, stayed in Q3. But you can see the numbers get more and more negative. So essentially, if you are becoming more successful, if you're moving up in terms of earnings, you are not opening these firms, right? And the positive probabilities have mostly to do with people who are not employed in year T-1, which fits with the notion that opening self-employed firms is actually being something more like a push. And then finally, let me just talk quickly about the ethnic. Let me just talk quickly about the ethnic concentration. Okay. There's two. I want to talk about. There's a whole set of variables we have here. We have expected revenues. We have the number of people who are under age 18 and over age 65, so potentially they're your market but not your workers. But I want to talk about 2 of the variables in particular. One is the expected wage that you would think you would get as a worker. So you're trying to decide whether to open a firm or not, and you're trying to think about what your opportunity cost here is. Now what we can do in this data is we could look at a set of other people who look just like you but are from previous arrival cohorts. Okay, so just like you, I mean same education, same age, same gender, same location, which here is census divisions, okay, and same source country. And when we can go to the data and say, okay, what are the average earnings for somebody who looks just like you in your same location? And is that related to whether or not you open a firm? Now the problem with that is that when we do that, if you're a person who's in a location with high earnings, that could also be a high productivity place to open a firm. So you could potentially see a nice, real positive effect from that. So what we do instead is we say, okay, I want to construct a measure of something that looks more like, are you going to be in a good bargaining position here? And the way we're going to do that is we're going to look at people in your same cell, defined all in the same way I just said a moment ago. We're going to say, what industries are they in, and are those tending to be high wage industries? If you're in a high wage, high rent industry, even if, or you're in a group who has access to high rent industries, even if you're not in that industry, you can go to your employer and say, look, I can get a job in the steel mill. My people, have steel mill jobs. You better pay me well or else I'm out of here. So so you can bargain a better wage. So we construct a measure that is exactly that for workers, and then for firms, and this is the kind of the cool one, I have 4 seconds to do this. For firms, what we can do is we can say for entrepreneurs who are exactly your same group, so same education, same age, same source country, same location, I can look at who they employ. Okay, do they employ disproportionately people from their same ethnic group? Then we can go and look at the workers from that ethnic group and say, what industries are they in? What are their outside options? If you face a bunch of workers who have really strong outside options, who tend to work in high-paying industries, you're not going to be able to pay them a low wage. You're going to have to pay them a high wage. So the enclave, in some sense, is the effect of allowing you to have access to workers whose outside options are not good. So let me just finally show you that, in fact, this is what you see. What you see is that the expected, so mean immigrant income from prior arriving cohorts has a positive effect on opening an incorporated firm. Expected wages that you would get yourself and that you would expect to pay as a firm, again, constructed in these kind of option ways, have negative effects. The employment rate has a negative effect, which you would expect. The tighter the labor market, the worse you are as a firm, the better you are as a worker. Expected revenues having no great effect. The proportion of owners of prior arrivals from your same source country who are owners have a positive effect. And altogether, those things imply that, that enclaves actually tend to be good places to open firms. They tend to be places with low wages, lower employment rates, and higher prior proportions who are entrants. After you take that into account, though, you see over here that the concentration, the ethnic concentration, which was the same variable you saw earlier, has a negative overall effect. And on the other hand, for the self-employed, almost none of the patterns work. They don't look particularly rational. And so the conclusion from our point of view is that what you can see is that there are these factors that are driving opening of firms. They tend to work in quite a rational way for opening incorporated firms. They tend to look like they're all over the map for the self-employed, who once again are tending to enter this from non-employment. And so our conclusion is really that there's a lot of evidence here that the majority of immigrant firm owners are being pushed in there, and so thinking of them as the source of innovation is probably not right. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, that's it.